So I want to welcome everyone to tonight's session for Philosophy Matters. And tonight the topic of discussion is the good life, different perspectives. And to say a little bit about what the talk's going to be about tonight, we all want our lives to actualise some conception of the good life, where this notion will generally include fulfilment, happiness, or well-being for ourselves, our family, friends, and other people. In addition, for many, to live the good life also entails living with concern for both self and others, based on moral and practical or prudential considerations. Is the good life about experiencing lasting pleasure and minimising suffering, as hedonism suggests? In contrast, altruism proposes we should do the most good we can through our life choices, practical efforts, and effective charity, while humanism promotes acting on values and concern for outcomes which respect and support other people and better their opportunities in the world. So tonight, Akiva Quinn and Usha Sista will explore perspectives on the good life as conceived by various philosophers, traditions, and writers, including Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Hugh Mackay, Peter Singer, Gretchen Rubin, and Elaine de Botton. They will present the hedonist perspective on the pursuit of happiness as constitutive of the good life and discuss how altruist and humanist approaches contrast with a focus on pleasure. Akiva will explore ideas about the good life as intrinsically and extrinsically related to a moral life. Usha will present some elements of a good life as laid out by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, and will also briefly cover the concept of eudaimonia, or flourishing or prosperity, as it ties in with the good life. So let me say a little bit about Akiva. Akiva Quinn, his first true love in the realm of ideas is philosophy, especially the sort of practical wisdom explored in applied ethics, moral, political, and social theory, or praxis. He studied philosophy and sociology at Monash University and completed an MA there in 2010. Akiva enjoys philosophy and literature with a focus on meaning and morality, and has co-presented workshops on living well and meaning in life. His other training is in computer science, and he works in software development, where logic and reason also play key roles and meaning can be crafted as well. Our second speaker, Usha, say a little bit about her. Usha's sister is a learning and development professional. She has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and Masters in English, as well as molecular biology. I'll say a little bit more about Usha when Usha comes to do her talk. So I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Akiva. Thank you, Akiva.
Thank you, Les. Appreciate your ongoing role and commitment, which I think is a marked contribution to the good life for all of us. So I really do appreciate that. And thanks to all of our participants, to my co-presenter, Usha, for coming along and being part of this discussion, and to all of you for being part of the discussion. I'm going to post a question right now in the chat. I'll probably pay attention more to my presentation, but for those who like to chat, there's an initial question. What constitutes the good life for you, which will also be covered in the slides. Let me go straight to the slides. So Usha and myself are going to offer perspectives, not necessarily that our perspectives will be different, but we're going to run through a number of different philosophical perspectives and indeed traditions in terms of what constitutes the good life, hence the first question, which I just posted in the chat. So overall, one could conceive of the good life as principally about or significantly about pleasure, and then some elements of purpose. Now, the perspective which I'll offer is that pleasure may indeed be and is part of the picture, but that there would be a perspective as well, or an elements of morality, life purpose, and attainment of virtue, or striving for virtue, which will be part of the good life as well. But I will run through those different perspectives. What constitutes the good life for you? We're going to try and explore in the presentation, and hopefully also in the discussion coming up afterwards. And I suppose roughly synonyms for the good life will be a life well lived or a happy life. All seem like worthwhile aims and a necessary part of the human experience. The other thought is what texts or thinkers, or indeed traditions, are going to best inform the elements of the good life. Anyway, so the second question was essentially what texts or indeed thinkers you would think best inform the elements of the good life. So let's continue. I'm going to suggest there's probably three main tranches in terms of broad approaches to the good life. One is to focus on the notion of pleasure, avoiding pain, basically, and maximizing the experience of pleasure in one's life. And I will suggest that it is rational for people to aim to maximize pleasure. So I think that's pretty much a given. The question is going to be, as we'll see, going back to Epicurus and the views on hedonism, whether that is sufficient, whether that entirely constitutes the good life, or whether there are other elements as well. Those who hold the moral life as equivalent to the good life would suggest that living well means to live a good life in a moral sense of the term, and altruism, concern for others, humanism, concern for human well-being, would certainly be among those views. The fulfilled life is probably the third stream in all of this, where a focus on character and happiness and indeed virtue would be what constitutes the good life. And Usha in particular will talk about virtue ethics and ideas from Aristotle, so I mostly won't delve into that. So if we look at the idea, and I've sort of set it up as a contrast. So is the good life about hedonism, or is it about something broader in terms of the social good or the human condition or humanistic concerns? So let's start with Epicurus. Imagine you're invited into a garden. That's where Epicurus entertained and engaged with his followers. So he essentially was espousing that the good is synonymous with pleasure. So really it's about minimizing pain, maximizing pleasure, not necessarily just in a sense of a sensual delight at that particular moment, but in the sense of a lasting or stable pleasure. So he understood well enough that satisfaction, tranquility, a life not concerned with matters of which would cause great anxiety. For example, a famous quote attributed to Epicurus is, "Death is nothing to us." So he wasn't concerned about the end of days. He wasn't concerned about the afterlife. He wasn't concerned about eternal damnation, which some later traditions have, focused on. He was mostly concerned with the here and now and living a measured but pleasurable existence. So the thought is whether equating the two, basically happiness and pleasure, and regarding that as the good life, will in some sense be self-limiting. And Henry Sidgwick in the 19th century, writing as one of the founders of the utilitarian movement within ethics, suggested that it was self-limiting. And certainly a lot of studies, this is what's known as the hedonist paradox, many of you will be very familiar with, is that a life dedicated to pleasure is often thwarted, basically, in the attainment of that pleasure other than fleetingly. So that's, I think, a very key principle that even from a pragmatic point of view, hedonism doesn't achieve in most cases based on lived experience, and the human condition doesn't actually achieve its stated aim. In addition, it's worth considering whether that would be a life worth living, whether it would be a life of true value. So when we talk about the good life, we're talking about the happy life, but we can't immediately assume or simply conclude the conversation by saying, well, if happiness is good, then the entirety of good is captured by achieving happiness for oneself and even for a circle of friends, for example, in Epicurus's garden. So the contrast, which I'm starting to draw then, is between an intrinsic value, which is assigned to pleasure. So it's valuable in and of itself, is the notion of intrinsic value. And in contrast to that, humanism suggests that human fulfillment, liberty, social well-being, concern for others, a common sense of responsibility for one's peers, one's community, one's country, and beyond is part of the good life. So it's really broadening from pleasure to purpose, as we termed it before, and to some sense of value beyond simply the joy of the next Big Mac burger or the next series on Netflix or whatever one's particular sensual delights might be. So that's the contrast I'd like to explore further now. So I'm going to just read this out in case any of you can't see it, and then it's kind of there in our consciousness. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry day and night. Of each day make a feast of rejoicing. Day and night dance and play. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head be washed, bathe in water. Cherish the child that holds your hand. Let a spouse delight in your bosom. Let me explain the context and the sense in which the way in which this text is, being presented here. It sounds like a whole lot of sensual pleasure, and it sounds like a recommendation to pursue all of these things. This particular epic is one of the early ethical texts, or it's presented as such. This extract might have you questioning as to why it would in any way be an ethical text. This is actually from about the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. So it's something around 5,000 years old. It comes from Sumer, which is modern day Iraq, and it deals with the king of Sumer. This is actually counsel offered to him, to said king, to Gilgamesh, from a barmaid at an inn where he's stopping over. So there's some parallels here with the life of relative luxury and indulgence that that the Buddha experienced before becoming the enlightened one, where he lived in the palace and then he went out beyond that and experienced the suffering and came up with the entire series of thoughts which became Buddhism. So Gilgamesh actually, after being entreated or told by the barmaid to act in this way, he actually went back to his kingdom and he focused, perhaps a little bit like the king of Bhutan, on the welfare of his citizens. So it's a cautionary tale, and in a way I'm presenting it as a transition between, or a transition from a sort of hedonistic approach where he could have continued to traverse the countryside and made merry day and night and delighted with his spouse and all the rest of it, but he made a different choice. So we'll kind of move from that idea of perhaps there's more than, hedonistic pleasure in terms of striving for the good life to the notion of what the good is. So Plato talks about the good basically as something unchanging. So he's a religious philosopher of the first order. He believes in spirit and he believes in the gods. So this particular quote from the Republic, the divine nature is as perfect as anything could be. Is something constant. And he also looks at beauty and courage and truth being all connected to each other. So the idea here is whether by understanding and directly connecting to the good, we can live the good life and basically understand beauty and the rest of it there. So I'll explain that a bit better in a moment. Ulysses, this is actually a quote from the movie starring Kirk Douglas, whether the Greeks were quite concerned with immortality, and so whether there's something particular in the human condition and a human life that is worthwhile. So Ulysses says, there are greater gifts to be born and to die, and in between to live like a man. So he actually rejects benefits of mortality because he wants the striving and the struggle, and Homer is writing basically about all of his adventures and conquests, and he finds that journey is more fulfilling than simply to have the blissful, never-ending existence of an immortal, of a god. And related to that is this idea again of beauty and love. And love for someone or something is what takes us beyond ourselves, and this unselfs us. And that's the basis Iris Murdoch, writing some decades ago, suggests for morality. So these ideas are really connection to value, be that beauty, learning, love, connection to others, concern for beyond self, unselfing, which put us in the moral domain and move us beyond happiness or simply personal pleasure as the basis for the good life. So Hugh Mackay has got an entire book on this topic, but the nub of it, it's worth reading the other few hundred pages, but he equates the moral life, he says, is the good life. So rather than the good life is pleasure or the good is pleasure, we've moved potentially, if you accept the thrust of the argument, we move to a moral consideration being the basis of the good life. The reasons why that would be the case, we spoke in the outline about the intrinsic value of morality and also an extrinsic value. So intrinsically, happiness and well-being are goods in and of themselves. And I've suggested there that they're social goods. So they're not simply goods which individuals experience in isolation, but they arise essentially in the context of relationships, love, as we said before, of other persons and other things. It can be beauty, appreciation of nature, appreciation of the world and things and, food and all the rest of it. But also that those social goods depend on people and place. The Blue Zones of Happiness, the book mentioned there by Dan Buettner, looks at how context, how people live in particular places has a huge impact on happiness. So again, it's not an atomic individualist pursuit. It really, the good of happiness, it is intrinsically valuable, but it arises in concert with other people. So hence a call towards some form of humanistic appreciation. Another concept will be that altruism, while it's good in itself, concern for others, it also gives rise to a sense of satisfaction for the person who is living a moral life. So whereas with hedonism, we have probably fairly clearly established it's self-defeating by and large, altruism is exactly the contrary, and there's a whole lot of scientific research on this. Matthew Ricard, there's a lot of TED Talks and so on. You can listen. He's a Buddhist monk in recent decades, although that's not how he started out. But he's done a lot of scientific research, and it benefits both altruistic individual, and clearly by definition, as well as being intrinsically kind of beneficial for the individual, it's instrumentally beneficial because it leads to the most good being done for others, as well as the side effect of creating satisfaction for ourselves. We can tie things into the US politic, because often that's where some of the profound thoughts, do come from, with particular historical times, no less today than in Martin Luther King Jr.'s time. Every man, or every person, if you prefer, must decide whether he or she will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. So the contrast is drawn up. In discussion, it would be interesting to see whether people think that's overly moralistic, but the idea is that there's a choice as to whether to be in the world with and for others, or to be in the world purely for ourselves. And the selfishness seems to be self-defeating in terms of any pleasure we might derive from it, and communally defeating in the sense of the good that could be done. So Peter Singer, for example, I haven't cited him in this particular context on the screen, but he's got a book last year or so, The Most Good You Can Do. And really it suggests that, like Hugh Mackay said just before, the moral life is the good life. It suggests that the most good that you can do is, the aim in life. And it doesn't have to be in a self-defeating way that one has to neglect oneself in any measure, but that one can do the most good while looking after oneself as clearly a very significant human being within the world, which you are, at your local center with respect to. So those were my thoughts. I've got a few references there. I didn't specifically get to talk about David Brooks, who's a New York Times columnist, and he's on the US PBS show for people who watch some of that television out of the US. And he wrote another book called The Road to Character a handful of years ago, which looks at really virtue and character as the essence of living a good life. And his second book, which I think is looking quite fascinating, it's on my reading list, is The Second Mountain, which suggests that while we often start off by climbing the ladder and looking at the material achievements which we can string together in a career and so on, the second mountain is really the interpersonal one and the personal one, where we're striving to develop ourselves as human beings and to put together the elements of a moral life. So in conclusion, for the first part, the moral and concern for others and the human family, to me, seems to be a core part of the moral life, along with concerns about our own pleasure and the well-being of ourselves and those in our immediate circle. So thank you. I think it's back to Les.
Thank you, Akiva, for a fantastic overview of the different approaches. I'd now like to introduce Usha, who's our second speaker tonight. Just let me say a little bit about Usha. Usha's sister is a learning and development professional. She has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and masters in English, as well as molecular biotechnology. Some of her key areas of interest are neurobiology of well-being and the behavioural and neurobiological underpinnings of deviant behaviour. She is a voracious reader and also paints and dabbles with photography and filmmaking. Usha is contemplating on establishing a literary magazine, and we wish her well with that. She's also crafting the details of her newly established consulting venture, and we hope that goes well. as well. So thank you, Usha. We're all looking forward to hearing you speak. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks, Les. Thanks, Akiva. That was a very graceful and very gratifying introduction from both of you. And thanks for inviting me to speak here. This is actually just my second time here in the meetings myself. So it's been quite an eventful time in a very, very good way. So I do thank Akiva mainly for getting me involved in all the early conversations and Les for guiding us through to this point. So I'm just going to share my presentation. A further exposition on what Akiva was mentioning about what are the different qualities of a good life. I thought I'd focus on someone who I had studied back in university. I'd studied the Nicomachean Ethics, large sections of it. And I thought he had something very interesting to say about the good life. So for Aristotle, the definition of a good life is to live a certain kind of life, which implies a rational principle. And it's the nature of a good man, a good person, to do whatever you do in a very noble way and performed with appropriate excellence. And if this is done, then happiness turns out to be an activity of the soul. So almost like happiness is a consequence of having done a multitude of things in a certain way. So Aristotle doesn't speak of happiness, and we'll get to what he meant by happiness next, as a state of mind or a state of being. It's not a feeling that he's talking about, but an outcome of living life a certain way. He calls it eudaimonia, which basically means good spirit. Daemons or spirits were what were believed to have been the driving forces of our emotional lives, of our lives in the world. And good demons, good daemons, basically refer to what we call a well-lived life, a flourishing, a thoughtful, and a noble life, and which is what has watered down and come to us as the term happiness. But I'm going to be using eudaimonia and happiness interchangeably here, but just would like to note that it's not a feeling that we're referring to here. So for Aristotle, eudaimonia is the highest aim. It is a virtue, and the pursuit of that highest aim is the virtuous life. So he's happy who lives in accordance with complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods. So he's not negating the materialistic life, but he's also saying that it's not a sufficient condition to call a life a good life if you are if you're only materialistically inclined or well-to-do. So apart from claiming that happiness or eudaimonia is a virtue, he's also saying that it's a conscious choice. It's not a happenstance. To live a life of this nature, it's something that we have to put conscious effort into, something we have to put thought into. A lot of deliberation has to go into it. So he says the conscious choice can go via voluntary acts, that is, things that we deliberate about and think about and do with the explicit aim of experiencing certain outcomes, hopefully good and noble outcomes. Involuntary acts are more like the conditioned acts or reflexes, which not necessarily destructive, but at the same time are not deliberate in intent. A non-voluntary act for him basically are things that we do sometimes even against knowing that something is going to give a negative outcome, we still do it. So example could be imbibing in alcohol a little too much, knowing that next morning we are going to wake up with a hangover by and large, or eating too much, gluttony, or all those come under non-voluntary acts for Aristotle. And this is in some ways a summary of what Akiva was saying as well. And Aristotle makes clear distinctions about the different kinds of happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics. The first kind, or the levels of happiness, being gratification and achievement, which is what we saw in Akiva's talk about, being simple pleasures, some level of hedonism involved over there, where we are thinking about how to be happy, the pursuit or the relentless pursuit of a pleasure-based life, a pleasure-driven life, and that includes money making, though Aristotle, as we'll see later, has a lot to speak about wealth and money and putting that money to good use, where it goes from being a question of simple gratification to contribution, perhaps not attainment at a high level, but definitely in terms of the social good, in terms of the moral good. We'll get there. The second kind, or the second level of happiness he talks about, is contribution, which is more to do with the altruistic life, the active way in which we engage ourselves in the worldly duties, in contributing to the society, in doing what is right by others and not just by ourselves. And for him, well, back in his times, it used to be more along the lines of honor, the honorable life, the righteous, the respectable life. And so that basically means that the honorable people are discerning in their actions. They have a good sense of discrimination between right and wrong, and then take the right value judgments and make the right decisions based on clear understanding of what is at stake. And in some ways, I didn't want to dwell on it, particularly on a different slide. So as an extension of contribution, particularly for Aristotle, the greatest good is actually politics. And for him, when he means politics, what he says is, while each of us is individually concerned about our eudaimonia, or the immediate flourishing of our families, communities, politics, on the other hand, is considered about it's about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So the aim of politics is to ensure or pave the way for eudaimonia for everybody in the society. That was Aristotle's definition of politics. I don't think that's what we mean or understand politics as it is in the world today. And the third level of happiness is attainment. And this is more along the contemplative traditions, not necessarily spiritual, but to a level of being hermetic and focusing on the wisdom traditions, perhaps becoming and being a teacher like Aristotle himself was. And in order to live any of the different levels of a good life, as we just saw earlier, he has many parameters, but we can focus on some of the key ones here. So courage, temperance, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity, gentleness, friendliness, truthfulness, and wittiness. In some ways, they are very Buddhist in their organization, in the sense that Buddhism speaks a lot about the middle ground, the Eightfold Path, not dwelling in the extremes of any situation, any emotional content. Aristotle is saying pretty much the same thing, of course, way before Buddha did. So one of them being courage. And that means when he says it's a mean in fear and confidence, it's being somewhere in between and knowing where to acknowledge each of those particular emotional qualities. He doesn't say that a courageous person doesn't feel fear at all. The courageous person sometimes feels that fear and even more terrified than others because he sees clearly. He has more discernment than others. So he picks out things that other people miss. But he endures that fear and does what must be done in a rational way. Because, and for Aristotle, that is beauty. That kind of action is beautiful action. And that's the beauty of a character. He calls that a beautiful character. And I'm actually in love with that phrase, beautiful character. Magnificence. Oh, I think generosity. Generosity has to do with money primarily, as to what people do with respect to money, how they think about it, and how they give that money. So this is the mean or the middle path between wastefulness and stinginess. So stinginess is when you take money too seriously, you're being miserly, you're overly attached to it. Wastefulness is not necessarily the opposite, where you still like money, you're still not underestimating the value of money, but then you have no good sense or direction of how to use that money. And that kind of wasteful action destroys the person who indulges in it. Gambling or any other form of addictive behavior, a person of that nature would have multiples of vices in that person, not just one. I don't know why it doesn't. Okay. So magnificence is similar to generosity, except that he has made the qualifying statement about a little bit of money and a lot of money. So he's talking about the really wealthy people who can, philanthropists, spending a lot of money. And he says even that can be extreme in the sense that you make a lot of pompous display about the money we give to organizations or charity or whatever, or we do it in a very tasteful, tactless way where we put other people down and show others as being incompetent or miserly. So while being magnificent with respect to money is wonderful, we have to do it in a tasteful and tactful way. Now, magnanimity is, it's a tricky thing in what he says. A magnanimous person essentially has all the qualities that we talk about as one having a good life. There's a fair bit of disclaimers here as to what a magnanimous person would be like. They don't take small risks, but they're not averse to risk taking. They're not susceptible to fashion and trends, and they're happy to help people, but at the same time, they're not overly focused on it. So they express their opinions out of esteem, out of love, out of respect, but at the same time, they can be reticent when they have to. So basically, a magnanimous person is someone who would live that thoughtful, good life. Gentleness. This is the other emotional mean concerning anger. So it's not that anger in itself is wrong. This is similar to, again, what Buddha says, right anger. To be angry about certain things is a virtuous act. It's the mark of a very thoughtful person. We have to be angered with certain criminal acts and intents and behaviors. That's right anger, but not quick temper, not to be led by that anger. We may experience the feeling of anger for any number of right reasons, but what we do about it, so the gentle person would not act out of impulsive decisions stemming from that anger. They would act based on reason, logic, rational thinking, even if anger is the determining, motivating factor behind it. Friendliness. These are some of the gentler virtues that Aristotle focuses on. The attitude towards people. And here, Aristotle doesn't mean being friendly or entertaining a lot of people or being overly nice, but friendliness for Aristotle is how we treat others. If I'm concerned about the pain that I might cause another person, then I'm friendly. But even there is a mean point. So an obsequious person is constantly concerned about he or she is always tiptoeing on eggshells. And when another person acts offended or is offended, they immediately, or even if this person fears that he or she has offended another one, he's going to back down very, very easily. It's almost like what we call in science the fight or flight response. So they flee from any kind of immediate, suspicious, negative, threatening environments. Whereas the opposite, the fight one, is the quarrelsome person. You know, they object to everything. They want to make pointless arguments, or they want to put in objections just for the sake of it. It gives them a high, it's a thrill. So that's another extreme that Aristotle warns us against. Truthfulness. Truthfulness, on the one hand, yes, it's about being honest, individual honesty, but it's also about how to interact socially, how to be almost Shakespearean, be true to thine self. But at the same time, so knowing who we are, knowing what kind of people we are, knowing our limitations, knowing our strengths and weaknesses, and projecting that as is in a community, in a society, not misrepresenting ourselves, nor boasting, not being vain about it. That's truthfulness for Aristotle. And the last of these is wittiness. This is the more entertainment kind and social engagement style of a good life that Aristotle, I was very surprised the first time I discovered this in a philosophical treatise. It's about being charming. It's about being tactful and being playful and jovial. And he makes the distinction that a buffoon, just can't resist making any joke at the cost, sometimes at the cost of causing pain to another person. Most of the jokes are perhaps tactless and pointless. But on the other hand, an uncultivated person is someone who doesn't get a joke and is serious and somber and quite useless in a playful conversation, and really doesn't add any humorous value to an informal social engagement. And Aristotle warns us against both these extremes as well. He talks about more social aspects of the good life, like justice and jurisprudence in other sections of the book, but that's really not we cannot cover that in this session. So I think that pretty much brings us to an end of what I had to say. But just as further reading, some people who have spent a lot of time on Aristotle and try to use his principles in their daily life, some of their books, The Happiness Project and Happier at Home by Gretchen Rubin. She has a yearly list of resolutions. She's dedicated a month of every year to a certain set of resolutions for every month of the year, and she tracks them, and she wants to find out how that helps her live that happy, flourishing life. I may have the book here. As Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist, positive affective psychologist who studied happiness in more scientific terms. Darren McMahon's Pursuit of Happiness, he wrote, it's a historical survey of how happiness has been studied and thought about across the centuries. And School of Life has published many, many books on various aspects of the good life. They have a School of Life dictionary, a beautiful compendium with weird meanings, almost like Samuel Johnson's fantastic dictionary. There's Small Pleasures that helps us focus on some of the simpler things that we might miss, or the big things that we could look at in a different way. A Job to Love, that's another book, A School of Life. Ellen de Botton has written a fair bit about eudaimonia. This is the pleasures and sorrows of work. I recommend all these books and many more actually to everyone who's interested in learning more. Thank you. Back to you, Les and Akiva.
Thank you, Usha, and Akiva as well for all of the great references. And I think some of those or all of those are in your slides. So hopefully we'll make the slide deck available shortly. But I'm continually impressed by how much the ancient Greeks still figure in our thinking today, not just Aristotle, but of course Plato and the Stoics and the Epicureans. And here we are talking about them 2,500 years later, and the ones we have been talking about, they still figure in philosophy courses today. So it's a real testament to their longevity. But I think I really like what you've done, Akiva and Usha, today in bringing together these strands for what makes a good life. So it's not just this or that, but you've brought together the subjective feeling of satisfaction and well-being, so the subjective component. You've brought in the external altruistic component about how we deal and help with our fellow creatures in society, and animals too. I always like to add in the animals these days. And the third component, which I must admit I don't think a lot about, but you've really brought home that, Usha, about working on our own virtue, building our characters. So having that comprehensive, all-rounded view of what it takes to have a good life. And it's not just about, what's good for you. It's how you interact.